Howdy, folks, and thanks for joining me today for another episode of Porch Talk. This is Howie here at Cedar Creek Homestead, and today's subject, last week, first off, I had talked about what if we had another depression. And this week I want to talk about surviving another Great Depression, or surviving perhaps just tough economic times. How would we go about doing that? But mostly just to reminisce about things when I was a youngster, how things were back during the day when I was growing up. Now, I wasn't old enough to be, of course, I hope you don't think I look old enough to be a Depression era person, but when I come along, the post-Depression type era, people, they were still recovering from the Depression. It was a very rough, terrible time, and it took years for people to get over it. So I'll share with you just for a minute here. First off, if you're not a subscriber, would you subscribe to our channel? We'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you for all you who have. And if you'll give us a thumbs up, that helps promote the video. After you subscribe, if you click that little bell icon right there, then you'll be notified anytime that we upload videos. You'll know. I try to do this Porch Talk every Tuesday at 7 o'clock if everything uploads and works out right. But anyhow, today is kind of just reminiscing about the way it was when I was growing up and what people told me and how it was. I was blessed here with my grandparents lived over here. They had survived the Depression as young people and had many stories, and they still lived their life like the Depression was still going on pretty much. I had neighbors right up here that we called Granny and Grandpa, but they weren't grandparents at all, but they were like grandparents to us. They were the same way. They lived clear up till their death. They lived up, near 90-year-old and lived every day just like they were going to go through another Great Depression. And then I had a great-grandmother, my grandfather's mother, who lived here in town, and she had a garden and a milk cow and chickens and everything. Looked like Granny Clampett on the Beverly Hillbillies. And she was, she still, when she died, she had every nook and cranny full of canned goods and stuff, and some of them had laughed about some of that stuff had gotten kind of old because she hadn't been rotating her stock, and she probably didn't eat as much as she had at one time. And then other folks that I've known, and almost all of the ones that I can remember, always told me that they thought one of these days we would go back into a Great Depression. The older folks. Now, I know we got older ones now, but the ones that when I was growing up 40, 50 years ago, the people from that era that come along that was older at that time, I thought they was old. They might not have been as old as I thought they were, but anyway, people would say they were still preparing, kept things going because they had lived without electricity and stuff, and out without modern conveniences, and had survived. There's a lady who lives up here on the mountain, and her husband, he's in his 90s and died a year or two ago. Very nice people. But I repaired her washing machine for her, and she told me that she still had a rub board. And she said, when I moved here, she said, we had no electricity, no running water. She said, I have a well out here that has never ran dry. She said, I still got the well bucket, and she does. Everything's still set up. She said, I could survive without all these modern conveniences. And she didn't like this new washer that had so many bells and whistles. I also had another customer that over here across the river, elderly woman that had never had a clothes dryer. She had always hung her clothes out on a line, and she had opportunity to sell her place, and they told her that they would buy it and give her good money for it, and she could live there until she passed away, and she did. But anyhow, she bought a clothes dryer because she said, I've never had any money. Now all of a sudden I've got all this money. So she said, I've always wanted a clothes dryer. So she went and bought one, had an electrician wire a plug in. She had plenty of room next to her washer, but he wired her in a dryer. She didn't know that you had to clean the lint screen. She had never never operated a dryer. So she was putting her clothes in there, and she calls one day and says her dryer's not heating anymore. So we go over and look at it, and the lint trap and the whole chute there was just plumb full of lint. And I said, boy, this looks like the lint's never been cleaned on it. She said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, you have to pull this screen out every time you do a load of laundry. You'll have to pull this out and clean it. And she didn't know that. She said, sir, she said, I'm so sorry, I didn't know. The heating element, everything was still good on the dryer. It just couldn't breathe to get any air outside. So I showed her how to operate the dryer. But there's still people that are alive right now in their 80s and 90s that were from that Depression era, and they still hang on to their money and stuff. They grew up either during that time or post-Depression when things were still bad. You know, there's a certain time they say the Depression ended, but I believe still into the 70s and 80s that people were recovering from this. So what I wanted to share today was the stories about one of my grandmothers. And first off, I'll back up and tell you this real quick. One of my aunts, she no longer cans and does all that kind of stuff, but they're retired and stuff, and they're in their 80s, but she always glamorizes the post-Depression type era that they grew up in. And she always made it sound so good. And one of the things that sounded so good about those rough times was that families were close. They were united. They got together for every little old thing. Pretty much got together once a week, whether there was a holiday or not. They all got together. Like over here, there was what we call the old home place. It's all tore down now, where my dad and all of his siblings were raised. And there's an old lane that comes up through there, and it's way out there. Well, they would gather every weekend and just visit, and maybe cook there or whatever. When he was growing up, his mom and dad, were still there and stuff. I'm talking about until my dad was the youngest one of the family. So until he was grown and his mother passed away, and my grandpa ended up marrying another lady. In fact, my grandmother died 30 days before I was born. So they they got together, and my aunt glamorizes that, talks about it. And I said one day, Auntie, would you like to go back to that old time way of living and the way things used to be? And she said, thought a minute. She said, no. She said, I like the modern conveniences. She said, one of my favorite things is not having to use an outhouse. So, but she said there is something that we've lost, and she said that's the family unity. Some have it, but more often than not, families have lost that in this modern era we're living in. And I know people criticize the Hispanic population, but one thing I have seen with the Hispanic population that has moved in, and they're hard workers and they're family oriented. It doesn't bother them for a whole group of them to live in one home. We've gotten so modernized here in the United States. Even people that have migrated from Mexico have gotten modernized like we have for the most part, I think, the way I've seen it. And you eventually get to where then you don't want people living with you. But there's some that have migrated here that they still live together. And so to me, they still have that family unity, and that's going to be some of their strength. But anyway, I want to tell about my grandmother on my grandma's side while I'm talking to you today, and just talking about, could you survive if you had to go back to living this way? And I'm going to tell you the story from the point of where I come in and am born, and come in on the scene, start getting old enough to remember things at my grandmother's house. And she lived, probably about 12 miles, maybe 10 or 12 miles from here, in a little town called Vian. And she lived out in the country there. But, excuse me, my grandfather died 2 or 3 years before I was born. And so couldn't have been much more than that, because my grandmother was pregnant with a child that was born the same day I was born, but a year prior. Our birthdays are on the same day. So her youngest child was, and she raised 12 children, and the youngest one or was a year older than me. Had been born a year before. So in that period, while she was pregnant with my uncle, my grandpa died of a heart attack, and they say he was alcoholic and stuff. Not going to get a bunch of details with that, but my grandmother had a rough time, and she had to raise these kids pretty much on her own, even though he was on the scene and stuff. And she just, and all of her kids, I'll say this, on my grandmother's side have always been very hard workers, and have survived because I think they were raised up during that rough period of time. And one thing that I'll tell you, when we were growing up, we'd go down to my grandmother's house at least once a week. And usually every time you went, you had pinto beans. Now, they might have fried potatoes, we might have a bologna sandwich or something, but you always had pinto beans. And there were many times that all you had was pinto beans. And during that time, we were eating so many beans at home and school and everywhere else that I would put mustard or ketchup or things like that, pepper juice. I don't do that much anymore, but if you can your own peppers, you take that pepper juice, is a little spicy, and you pour it in your beans, and it gives it a little different flavor. And one of my sisters has beans, did almost every day. I think she's not quite so bad now, even in her adult years, and she still uses a lot of pepper juice. But anyway, we would go down there, and one of the things I remember is my grandmother, she still had kids at home. She had 2 daughters and this youngest boy that I can remember that was still at home. But they would be doing laundry. And my grandmother had a wringer washer on the back porch. She didn't have a clothes dryer or nothing like that, but she had a wringer dryer on the front porch of the house. And they would be there washing and wringing the clothes through that wringer thing. I thought that was so fascinating. I've always loved being around people and hearing the old-time stories. If you're not into that, I know there's some that this bores you to tears. Don't listen, but this is something that I've always enjoyed. And it amazed me how people have made it without phones, electric, running water, all these different things throughout the years. And there's people that still do it today, and they're happy. They seem happier than people that have all these modern conveniences. But anyway, my grandmother and her daughters would be, that was still living at home, and sometimes they'd be some of the other children that had come and visited and brought their kids on a Saturday, and that's when my mom would usually buy groceries. So we'd go down and see my grandmother, spend the morning, maybe up till 1 or 2 o'clock, and then we would go buy groceries and come back home, and that was a pretty usual routine for a while as I was growing up. But anyway, they'd hang the clothes out on the line, and the water, my grandmother had a guttering that now would be classic, an old rustic looking guttering, but it was kind of like a galvanized metal stuff, kind of like the sheet iron you put on your home, but there was guttering made out of that. And that guttering went down, and they had these big foot tubs, and if you know what I'm talking about, they're big galvanized tubs, and they're about this deep and so big, and I think they call them like number 9, different sizes of foot tubs people had. I've got some now. I bought some old ones. I've even bought new ones and have them because they come in real handy when you're doing stuff in your garden and stuff. But anyway, they would put that underneath this guttering of this old house she had, and they would catch the water, because if they didn't, the water ran into a cistern underneath right there where the front porch was, and they had a vat thing made underneath that you could take a little concrete lid and lift off, and you could see down in there. And she had a hand pump, an old hand pump that you could pump the water out. Well, if you didn't have your water caught in these foot tubs, then you had to do that. So if a rain was coming, they would put these foot tubs in front of these guttering spouts, and that's what they used for their water. And they washed on Saturday. It was just like you observe the Lord's Day on Sunday, and we don't usually work and take off here. So that's the way they did their laundry. That's just a usual routine, and they hung it out to dry. Anyway, the water, when we were there, if you wanted water, my grandmother had a sink in the house. None of her cabinets had any doors. They just had little curtains that she would pull back, homemade little curtains she had made. But she had a sink, and when you ran water, you used water there at the sink. Of course, it ran outside, but you had to go get the water. There was no faucets there to turn on. Just the sink basin was all that was there. And when she was going to make tea or get water to wash with, she usually had several jugs of water sitting on the counter up there. But if she needed water, we would go out with her, and she had a hand-dug well, and we loved, as kids, that was the most fascinating thing, to go out and get water out of a well. And she had one of them old long galvanized-looking well buckets, and she would drop that down in there and pull up water. And we thought that was so neat. The one thing I didn't like was she had outhouse, and it was a 2-seater outhouse, and you had to walk around and go down to the creek. It was down near the creek to use that thing, and it was they kept it cleared and clean going to it, but the creek and stuff, the vines and things was growing up, and it was kind of spooky. And my uncle would tell us scary stories that he had seen monsters and stuff down there. And of course, he was a year older than us, than I was, and I'm the oldest of my group. So he would tell you these stories and things, and have us scared to death. And I was always afraid a monster was going to come out behind the outhouse or jump out of the trail and get you or something. It was always kind of scary. But anyway, my grandmother canned and never had a car, never owned a car. My grandfather, they say, didn't drive either. I don't know why, if he just never could afford a car, but people would from time to time take him places and do things, but they said he walked. And a lot of the people that, a man that just died not long ago there in Vian, he said, I used to see your grandpa walking, and he said, I'd pick him up. And like he'd be going to the store or coming home from the store, and he'd pick him up because I guess he'd have his hands full of groceries, and that's just how they did things. One thing that was kind of neat, when my grandfather died, my grandma went to the local hardware store to pay on a stove they had bought. And the store people there told her, said, you don't have to pay that anymore because your husband, it was in his name, and he's dead now, so you don't have to pay the bill. And my grandmother insisted on continuing to pay that stove off that they had bought. They had bought a propane gas cook stove for her house. Before I come along, my dad said that when him and my mom got married, that my grandmother had dirt floor, and when he was dating my mom. And my mom and him was just married a little over a year before I come along. So in the process of during that time, they had rebuilt her little house, and it had put a wood floor in it and everything. And so that was the one I come to know. But my dad said that my grandmother kept that dirt floor of the old house clean and neat, and they would keep it slicked off. And how they do it, I don't know, but he told the story of how it was. So she lived with a dirt floor, raised 12 kids in an old house without electric, without running water, without air conditioning, without TV, without computers, without cell phones, without all this modern stuff, and they all survived. So now some have passed on now as they've gotten older, and my grandmother has passed away. She lived up in her 90s. But anyway, when we got to go there as kids, of course they had dirt floor, but no running water, anything like that. But it was fascinating to see how things were. And I always imagined myself as a very young kid going to where there really was the old-fashioned days, and it just was really neat to go there. I'm sure it wasn't as neat as I thought it was, but I thought it was very fascinating. But in the process, when I got on up a little bit older, my dad and the uncles and all them, they built a lean-to, and you'll see a lot of homes here will have a lean-to. My grandfather's house over here had a lean-to on it, but they added a little room where they would put a bathroom and a bathtub, and they would add running water, and then you had indoor plumbing. One thing that our house had, my aunt had it built, and my dad bought it from her when I come along. We moved here, and actually, I guess when I was born, they were already living here in this house. But anyway, this house didn't have a place for a washer and dryer, but it had a bathroom in it. and a little bitty bathroom, but it had a bathroom, and that was just style back then. But my dad and them had a wash house, and the washer and dryer actually went outside in this separate little building. And a lot of people around here, when I was growing up, had a little outbuilding, some still do, that the washer and dryer sets out in another building. Well, my grandmother, when they built that lean-to for her, they also made enough space there when they built it to where they could add her a washer and a dryer. And my grandmother still hung out clothes till she was very on up in years, but she had that convenience where in the winter she wouldn't have to go out and stuff. And that kind of stepped her up into modern times. She still had the outhouse until on up probably 20 years ago or so. The outhouse still was there because she always thought if things got bad and she needed it, she could use it. They hooked up plumbing and fixed up a well, a pump and stuff in for her so that she could have running water in her home. In her latter years there, they hooked on to rural water so that she didn't have to worry about the pump house and all that stuff. But my grandmother survived all those years up till not very many years ago. She finally got a telephone. And my grandmother would write you letters. I've still got some, but she was real good to write letters. Her penmanship wasn't real good, but she loved to write you a letter. So she'd write me a letter. It might be 2 or 3 pages long. When I moved off from this area for a while, was she'd write me letters and want to know how things were going. And when they used a phone, she'd tell stories about, like she hurt her arm one time and needed to go to the doctor, and they went up to this guy named Mr. Gossett, and they always used his phone, but it was a pretty good walk. She lived down a long lane on a county road, and then you had to walk clear down to his place, and he was on a long lane. So my grandmother just hardly ever needed a phone. If she did, she just sent the kids to go up there to call one of her adult children or someone they knew to come and get them, to take them to the doctor or whatever. And so my grandmother got a phone, and I would call her like at Christmas or different times to wish her, happy holiday or whatever. And she wouldn't talk to you but just for a very few minutes, and she wanted to get off the phone because she felt a telephone was for just a dire emergency. And up until she passed, she still raised a big garden. One of her sons come and checked on her every day, and he would eat supper with her every night. And him and his wife had divorced, so he would come down and eat supper every night with her and take care of her, and he'd help her with the garden and stuff. But her place was just as neat as a pin. She had all kinds of flowers and neat things. And when we moved back here, our house had burnt. And so we were kind of recovering from that type of stuff when we moved from Arkansas to Oklahoma. And my grandmother gave us a quilt she had made. And it was a sure enough homemade quilt. I mean, we still got it here, but it was type they take the strings and tie in, and it had sure enough, old pieces of clothing from her. That means a whole lot to me because it was made with love, something that she cared about and done, and it really touched my heart. And I said, "No, Granny, you need to keep this," and she, "I've made a bunch." And that was something she did in the winter when she couldn't garden and do other things. She made quilts. And some of the memories I have was eating at her house, and everybody would gather there like at the holidays, and like on Saturdays if we went, it wouldn't be nothing for more folks to be there. And like I say, a lot of times all we had was beans. But at Christmas and Thanksgiving stuff, she made a big pot of chili beans to go along with the Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever dinners we had there. And one of the funny things about that is I loved her chili beans. She made the best chili beans, and she told me her ingredients, and I got some and tried to make, and it just didn't make it like Granny made it. I can't make it like her. It tastes somewhat, but it's not the same. But she could make the best chili beans. And people say for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and someone told me one time, said that's kind of weird that you'd have chili beans at the holidays like that. And so anyway, I was telling my mom about it one day visiting, and my mom said, well, the reason she did that was to make things go further. So that was a filler that you could make real cheap, and everybody liked her chili beans, so that's something Grandma could make that was cheap, and it would go along, with the other stuff. But I had always just thought it was just so super good. But my grandmother always told me, and she said she thought we were going into another depression. And like I say, she done without a phone all those years, did without air conditioning. They finally, in her older years, probably she was in her upper 70s, somewhere in there, the children bought a window unit. And they told her that they would pay her electric bill. She was afraid she couldn't pay the electric bill. When my grandfather died, he was on disability for something. And so my grandmother still drew a check somehow from him, and having those children there. And she didn't have much money at all, and really had a rough go, even though she didn't have all these modern conveniences. She had electric bill to pay, but she didn't have to pay a water, no car insurance, no car tags, nothing like that, but she survived on that. But I remember them getting commodities. And if you're familiar with the Indians, because we're in Indian Nation here in Oklahoma, in fact, this is the Cherokee Nation territory where we live out here, but they used to, and they still yet do today, they gave out commodities to the Indians that was in these little metal cans, and it'd have a picture of a chicken on it or whatever, and they made beef stew, pork, beef, vegetables, all the basics, but you had to cook it and go. Well, my grandmother got commodities, and so I remember her having that, and I can remember going down on Saturdays and her making homemade hominy, and she would have a little fire built and a kettle outside, and there's quite a process to go through. But I've always loved hominy, and I think it was because my grandmother made hominy for us, and it was homemade. Sorry about that. But anyway, she done without air conditioning, done without phone, and she survived with that there, and lived on very little. And so you could survive, is the point I want to bring today. You could survive without all these modern conveniences. And I also think sometimes we'd be better off. I think families would be closer, they'd be strengthened, people would be united and help one another more. My grandmother lived up in her 90s, and on, I believe it was her 90th birthday, that they had a big party for her. And she fell on her 90th, on that particular birthday, and broke her hip. And she had never been hospitalized. She had had all of her children at home. She had hurt her arm one time and went down, had someone take her to the doctor's office. But otherwise, she had never been hospitalized. But when they had her there, they fixed her hip problem, fixed that however, and she got to where she was still kind of crippled afterwards, but she could get around pretty good. But they said she had a bad heart, and they said, we need to do surgery, but at her age and her condition now, if we did surgery, it would kill her. Well, Grandma was like, there is no way that they're going to operate on me. She said, I want to go home. And just as quick as she could go home, they took her home, and she was very independent. In her last days, she lived another year or two after that, but they said that one day her heart's going to give out and she's going to die. But she had never complained about, thought about, whatever. But anyway, finally she did. She got got real sick and was having chest pains and stuff, and they took her and they kept her in the hospital, and she passed away there. But she pretty much got to live an independent lifestyle. She was very independent. She always had a shotgun leaning up next to the door, and she had ran people off with the shotgun before. People come there that didn't belong there, or salespeople, or people that if she was concerned, she just reached over here in the corner and got this old shotgun and she ran it off. Even ran her children off one time, was giving her fits, telling her what she was going to do, and she said, do y'all need to leave? And they got outside and they started mouthing her, and the others that were there said that she grabbed the old shotgun and said they got in their vehicles and she shot up in the air over them, but up high. Said she wasn't shooting at them, but she shot up in the air, and she let them know that she was still Miss Independent and she was going to survive. So, just funny stories. She raised chickens and hogs and different things. Now, as she got up probably in her 70s, I would say, somewhere in there. She quit raising meat so much and stuff like that. And of course, at her age, she didn't need all that, and it was a lot of work on her, and she had started slowing down, but she still did a lot of stuff and was very independent. And I remember not long before she died, I went down and was visiting with her, and she cooked supper, and I should have ate supper with her, but I didn't. But she was the type, if you were there and it was supper time, she wanted you to eat. It was just her son come there that he'd eat with her every day, and it felt like, I had watched her cook everything. I felt like she didn't have enough to cook. I wasn't really hungry, and I said, "No, Grandma, I'm not hungry," but I should have ate there had I known. But anyway, I love reminiscing, thinking about the good old days, and my main thought today on today's Porch Talk is, could you survive if you had to go back without all these things? I think I could. If you have a water source, if you have a food source, you have a little piece of property. You don't need a whole lot. My grandmother probably had 5 acres there, and she probably mostly used an acre of it in real good heavy-duty use. One of my uncles owns it now, and the property, and he keeps it all mowed. The old house is still there. One of these days, if I ever get a chance, and he would let me, I'd like to go there and kind of film a little film around and show you some of the stuff. It's still, a lot of it's what I remember as a child. Of course, the outhouses are gone, but the old storm shelter, that type of stuff is still there, the cistern and things. And my uncle's pretty much just left it just like it was, but he keeps everything tidy in the house and the yard, and still raises a big garden, and he's put up a real nice pipe fence along the road to keep people from coming in there and looting or causing whatever there. But anyway, I have thought a lot lately, especially I've always thought that what if we ever had to go back to those days? Could we survive? And I've definitely been thinking that lately and trying to prepare us and have our goals on extra water catchment, food sources. We've been doing that anyway, but the water sources. Now we have water sources, but I've had to sit down and say, okay, where are they at? What would we do if things come bad? Or what if we had to go into another grid down, lockdown situation, kind of like we went through with the Kung flu? What if we had to go back to that again? Maybe this winter, I want to be better prepared. I think we did really well. We didn't have to panic and run out and buy toilet paper. We didn't have to panic and run out and buy food. We didn't have to fight the crowds because we were prepared. I want to be better prepared for that. But I also want to be ready if we had to do without electricity. What if you didn't have running water? Would you be willing to go get it? Take a lot more stamina to be able to go get the stuff. But I have evaluated things here, and it's like, could we survive? How would we manage? We've done some things like bought an incubator, a cabinet-style incubator, where we could hatch a lot of eggs because people were having trouble during this buying chickens from the farm stores. Some have been sold out. These Cornish cross birds, a lot of the places are sold out to this fall, which is okay. I'm thinking about getting my name on the list and order some of them. I prefer the homegrown birds over the Cornish cross. It's just that the Cornish cross are more economic to raise, and you get more meat off of them. For like if Stacy Josie, she likes to can and stuff. So, but anyhow, just some thoughts there I wanted to share with you today about my grandmother and the way things, to me, the way I looked at that growing up was that she was pretty primitive. There were others around here like that, but she was one of the few that definitely done without and survived. And like I say, she never drove a car, never had a driver's license, never owned a cell phone, had no idea how to operate a cell phone, never had a computer. I will tell you this funny little story about my grandmother. Is when I would stay there with her, we would watch Gunsmoke, and she had a little old television, little old dinky thing, and it sat over there, and she hardly watched any TV, but she would watch the 10 o'clock news and then it was either at 10:30 or 11, Gunsmoke come on. And she loved to watch Gunsmoke, and so we would watch that. And then, like if whatever time it was, then that meant an hour later that when it was over, we went straight to bed. And her beds seemed like they were as tall as I was off the ground. I mean, you had to crawl to get up in the beds. And blankets, there'd be so many blankets you couldn't hardly turn over. But anyway, we would watch Gunsmoke, and that was and I love Gunsmoke today, and I think it's because I watched it with my grandma. But she still got up in the mornings very early, and she was one of those that got up at 5 o'clock in the morning whether she needed to or not, but that's just how she done things. But she'd get up and start a pot of coffee on the stove, and that's just the way she operated. But it was really fun memories. And one particular time I spent the night with her there as a young kid, and the Gunsmoke didn't come on that night. They had a movie that night that come on after the news, and there was a guy on there named Papa Ross, and my grandma, for some reason after that, she started calling me Papa Ross. And if anytime she seen me or whatever, and even in her letters, she would write something about to Papa Ross. And so and I cannot find what this movie was, that this character, if you know, leave it down in the it seems like it was a Western, but it had a guy that they called Papa Ross. And so for some reason, my grandmother got to call me that, and that just kind of stuck, and clear up until her death was she called me Papa Ross. But anyway, we enjoyed watching that. That was kind of a treat to watch TV there. I hope on some other videos I can share with you about my grandparents that lived over here and my great-grandmother that lived in town. And I have from time to time, and I try to tell each one a little separate, like this was my biological mom's mother that I just told the story about, because if I get all these grandparents and people I knew all mixed together, it gets kind of complicated. Anyway, I sure appreciate you watching today's Porch Talk. If you're not a subscriber, if you'd hit the subscribe button, it would greatly help us out. And we hope you're doing well, and I want to say God bless you. And we'll see you next time here for more Porch Talk on Tuesday nights at 7 o'clock. God bless you, and we're gone.